Good evening, everyone. I'm thrilled to see so many of you here today as we welcome Dr. O'Connell for this very special evening. We're going to begin with a little scripture reading and prayer. When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate people one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will put the sheep at his right hand and the goats at his left. Then the king will say to those on his right hand, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? And when was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you?" And the king will answer them, "Truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of these least who are members of my family, you did it to me." Loving God, help us to see your face in those most vulnerable. Help us to be beacons of light in the darkness of the world. Help us truly to be your disciples. We make our prayer through Christ our Lord. Amen. Now I'm very happy to introduce first Dr. Mary Mullen, who is a longtime dear friend of Dr. O'Connell's and also was his junior intern, also a colleague at Harvard Medical School. And thank you, Mary Mullen.
Thank you, Father. During this season of Lent, our St. John, St. Paul Parish Collaborative is discussing the book, Let Us Dream, by Pope Francis. The book is divided into 3 sections. And last week, our coordinator of pastoral care, Mary Campion, and our dear friend, Sister Evelyn Ronan, guided a tremendous parish turnout in a discussion of Part 1, A Time to Seek. During that discussion, we were asked, what are some things that we overlook, to which we are indifferent, that we need to pay more attention to? We spoke of loss and illness, hunger and mental health, and homelessness. Things we know exist, but that are too often invisible to us. How appropriate to have our guest tonight, Dr. James O'Connell, speak with us about his life work in the care of the homeless and his book, Stories from the Shadows, Reflections of a Street Doctor. Since 1985, when he founded the Boston Healthcare for the Homeless program, Dr. O'Connell has been working on the streets of Boston to serve and aid the homeless in our community. His passion for this work grew over time. After graduating from Notre Dame, he studied philosophy and theology at Cambridge University, taught school, explored political theory, and eventually found his calling in medicine. He graduated from Harvard Medical School and then trained in internal medicine at the Massachusetts General Hospital. His passion to care for the most needy in our society led him to be the first physician associated with the homeless clinic in Boston. And now, more than 35 years later, that commitment to service has blossomed into the comprehensive Boston Healthcare for the Homeless program. Each day, he cares for some of the most challenging patients in our world, affected by chronic disease, malnutrition, mental health problems, addiction, lack of resources or shelter, and poverty. Undaunted, Dr. O'Connell and his team have brought compassion, care, and medical service to this most vulnerable population. I've had the privilege of knowing Dr. O'Connell since my earliest days of training at the MGH. He is revered for his commitment and energy, his profound insistence that now is a time to see the people hidden in the shadows of our society and to serve them with integrity, science, and sustained engagement. This is real boots on the ground work to help the most marginalized in our community. His work has been recognized with the Albert Schweitzer Humanitarian Award, an honorary degree from Holy Cross, and profiles in major media outlets like NPR and CBS News. It is my pleasure to introduce one of the most admired leaders and physicians in American medicine, Dr. James O'Connell.
Thank you very much, Mary. So, can you hear me okay? The mic is on. So, as I'm sitting here and watching everybody come in, it's just highly embarrassing because I'm around some of my classmates from Notre Dame are here. That was a couple of years ago. Is that not loud enough? Okay. And thank you for being here, by the way, Pat and Dave, wherever you are. And then I saw John Bernardo, Dr. Bernardo, who was a physician working at Pine Street Inn doing TB care when I first started, and he's still doing it. So thank you to John. He's been our guide through all that. And then, I have to say a special thanks to Mary, because Mary and I lived through the days on the Bigelow when it was day and night. We were on every third night. And you really get to see and know people during those circumstances. I also have to say a special thank you to Kevin and Ann Phelan, because Kevin has sort of introduced me and allowed me to be part of most of what goes on in Boston, to see it from a side that I would never have seen anymore. So Kevin, thank you for that. And we happen to be both Providence College fans, since I grew up in Newport, Rhode Island, and lived on Providence College basketball. So both Notre Dame, I think Notre Dame's playing tonight, and Providence College is playing tomorrow. And then Andrea and Riley and Tom Gaziano to thank you, because I know I have you two to thank for this. So wherever you are, thank you. I can't see that. You can't hear, can you? Let me try to take this up, and maybe I can just put it in front of me. Sure, I'll take that. Would that be easier?
I think it'll be louder.
Okay. Is that better? Can you hear me better or no? That's better. Okay. I apologize. And if this echoes, let me know. I'll take that off. But anyway, so thank you all. I feel like I'm among friends, and it's really, really nice. I also feel like I don't have anything to tell you that you don't already know. Now I got to do the other one. Yes. Oh, here, I know what I can do. I can just turn it up here, Father. Perfect. Let me give you that. And can you grab that out? Yeah. Okay. So I told you I was embarrassed to be here. So let me, if it's okay, I would love to just throw out a few thoughts and maybe a couple stories, and then hopefully we can just have a discussion about what's going on. Because I have, one of the things that's been really difficult for us, in both personally and in our program, is to think back in 1985 that we were tackling what we thought was a short-term problem. We were going to fix it. And over the years, I think it's grown more and more complicated, and the solutions and what we should all do seem to get harder and harder to figure out. So I think we need all of us to help try to figure it out. But let me just share with you. So there was a whole part of what Mary was introducing. There was a whole almost 10-year period in my life between college and getting to medical school that my mother would never let me talk about, okay? And I used to only discuss it when we would have a scotch down at a bar somewhere, and I could tell you. But, so I didn't know what I wanted to do. I liked lots of things. I actually loved lots of things, but I couldn't find what was really grabbing me. And it was, Pat and Dave and I graduated in 1970, which was the year of Kent State. And it was turmoil, and the country was divided. And it was just crazy. But we really wanted to do something meaningful, and I couldn't find something meaningful to do. So, just like Mary said, I went to graduate school for a while, taught high school for a while, ran a restaurant for a year, drove cabs, did political philosophy for a little bit, thinking that might be my academic world, and then ended up quite by accident in deciding I wanted to be a doctor late in life, and started medical school when I was almost 31. But I was lucky. I'm sort of the accidental tourist. I loved medicine. I finally found something I loved doing, wanted to become an oncologist, and as serendipity has it, our chief of medicine, who was John Potts in those days, was involved with the city in trying to help get a grant to take care of homeless people because it was a rising problem in the early to mid 1980s. And so John Potts, with another wonderful doctor named Tom Durant, called me into the office when I was in March of my senior year, wherever you are, Mary. And it's like getting called into the principal's office. It's like, oh God, what have I done now? And the two of them were sitting there. And if I had not learned anything in my, up till that point, 37 years, I knew that when you're in that spot, all questions are rhetorical. So I said, when they said, would you mind taking a year and doing this new program? Because they wanted a full-time doctor. I said, of course, I'll do it for a year. And I thought in my mind, this would be my year of giving back, would be my year of solving my late 60s conscience, as many of us were trying to do. And I took the job. And I remember finishing my last rotation was the ICU at MGH. And that was in June, and July 1st, I went down to Pine Street Inn to start working in the clinic at Pine Street. And you have to put yourself in my little world. So I'm finally a doctor. I'm finished my training, and I'm excited to have a new job. And incidentally, after you've been in the ICU for a month, you think you can handle anything in the world, right? So you've got this huge ego. And I walked into the Pine Street, which had 800 people staying there back then. And I walked in, and there were these nurses in a clinic working like crazy who knew all the homeless people. And they looked at me. I have an older sister who's a nurse, so if any of you are nurses, you'll appreciate this. And so I know the look when the nurses don't want you around. And I felt terrible. Here I am thinking they were going to be thrilled to have me, and they didn't care. So what they did is they sat me down, and I wrote about this a little bit in the book. They sat me down and explained very clearly that I had been trained all wrong, that if you really want to get to know someone who's homeless and take care of them, you have to take time. And if there's one thing that we don't value when we're training is taking a lot of time with your patients. It's the shorter the time, the more efficient you are, kind of the better. And so that was kind of a blow. And they said, so what you have to do is learn how to, all the things that, by the way, these are all the things that I thought were beyond the patient-doctor relationship, that over boundaries. They said, have coffee with people, listen to them, talk to them, get to know them, tell them about yourself, all the things that, we weren't supposed to be doing. And so I thought this was kind of a weird job to get. And the next thing they did was show me, and if you went into the Pine Street Inn clinic where the nurses were, as you came in the waiting room, there were about 12 of those chairs in it. Used to have the arms like this, and there were 12 of those chairs, and they would invite men, and this was on the men's side, to come in and soak their feet. So they would have a bucket full of warm water. We used to put betadine in there, remember that? And I don't tell you, I think that we thought that was cleansing. It may have been bad now that I think about it. But it was brilliant. I looked at the nurses, and all these men who I knew from the streets or something like that, really crusty guys, were sitting there absolutely angelic, having their feet soaked while the nurses took care of them. And so Barbara McGinnis, who was the head nurse back there, who John and Bernardo and I got to know incredibly well. Barbara, who, by the way, I learned later was a third-order Franciscan. She used to wear sandals and was just the best human being you could ever imagine. But so she said, took away my stethoscope, took away all the stuff that I had that was my doctor stuff, and I had to soak feet for 2 months. That was my apprenticeship. And I can remember writing home, because in those days we didn't have texts or anything like that, writing home telling my parents I think I had done the wrong thing, that I would wish I hadn't given up my fellowship that year. But I soaked feet for a couple months and learned a lot from the nurses. One is it flipped the power structure, so instead of a stethoscope's length away from somebody's very private personal space, you were at their feet and you could serve. And I wasn't allowed to ask any of those usual questions like, are you hearing any voices, or or you've got any chest pain, or none of that. You could just say, can I help? Anything else you would like? And it was all service. And I know it sounds now as I'm describing it entirely biblical, but I didn't see it then as biblical. It was a very smelly room full of all this stuff, but it was very profound. A story as I would tell it is there was one man who I remember Barbara made me soak his feet because he was particularly crusty. And he had been somebody we had seen in the emergency room many, many times at Mass General, and we had put in the chart that he had terrible paranoid schizophrenia, and he was treatment resistant, so we could never get him to do anything in the emergency room. And I soaked his feet probably for about 6 weeks. And one night, he looked down at me, I never said anything, and he goes, "Hey, I thought you were supposed to be a doctor." And believe it or not, I can remember lighting up then because for 6 weeks I had been working in the clinic and no one acknowledged that I was a doctor, right? So I love this guy for saying that. And I said, "I am." And then he goes, "Well, what the hell are you doing soaking feet?" And I didn't know what to say, except what I would say to my older sister. I said, I don't know, but I always do whatever the nurses tell me to do. And interestingly, that hit a nerve for him because he always did what the nurses told him to do too. And so a week after that, he asked me if I could give him something to help him sleep. And he just said, "I can't sleep, Doc. Can you give me something to help me out?" And to make a very long story short, within a month, he was taking all the medicine that we had spent years at Mass General trying to get him to take, but he would never take. And I started to realize the brilliance in what the nurses had said. It was taking time that he could get to know that I was there, not to take him away. We could earn some trust, earn some time. And that became kind of the foundation, I think, of what we all learned from the nurses, and I hope continue to do. Second thing I learned about, though, and I don't know if John Bernardo will remember this man, but there was a guy named Amerigo. He came in, he was the loudest guy at Pine Street. You could walk in and there'd be this, 200 people in a room and you could hear his laugh above everything else. He was a character. And one night he came into me and he said, "Doc, you have to do something." And I went, "Sure." I'm trying, by the way, I'm trying to show the patients and the nurses that I'm good. I want to show them, earn my credibility. And I said, "Well, what can I do for you, Amerigo?" And he said, "Well, Doc, I cannot swallow my vodka, and you got to do something." And it's the first time I'd had that chief complaint, by the way. I don't know if anybody had that. But that's a scary thing to say. If you can't swallow, something is probably going wrong. Sure enough, he had a huge cancer right in his esophagus where you swallow, and it was blocking everything going down. And when I asked him a couple questions, he said he hadn't been able to eat food for about 6 months, but he could still get his liquid down, and vodka was what he mostly depended on. And he said, so I learned then that when you're living on the edge of survival, you don't go to see the doctor until something doesn't work anymore. It's not just a little inconvenience or a little pain. When something doesn't function, then you go to need help. And so it turned out he had, we couldn't do anything. It was beyond any kind of care. So I had sat down with him, and after we did all the workup and said, this is really bad, Amerigo. You probably have another number of weeks to live, but we can't do much about it. We could put a tube in to bypass that and feed him through the tube. And I spent the weekend, I'll never forget this, getting him a nursing home bed where he could die with dignity. I did not want him to die at Pine Street in the middle of all that. And so I did all that. I was proud of myself. He actually got a place at a nursing home in South Boston where he had grown up, not far from where he had grown up. And I brought him over there, got him settled in, and I was really proud of myself. Thought, I've finally done something good. And I came back to Pine Street this was on Sunday, I brought him into the nursing home. And Wednesday, I came back to Pine Street, and I'm walking down the alleyway to come in. And I can hear his laugh, and I'm trying to figure out, oh, this is trouble. And I went down, and he has this feeding tube in, right? And I walked down there. What he's got is his bottle of vodka, and he's pouring it right into his feeding tube. And, so I wanted to, kill him. Amerigo, what are you doing? And then he read me the riot act. It just stood me right up on my heels. He said, "Doc, thanks for doing all that. But you know what? In the nursing home, I didn't know anybody. Nobody was talking to me. Most people were just staring out the window or watching TV. He said, these are my friends. I'm here. This is where I want to be. If I'm going to die, I want to be around all the people I've been with for 30 years. So I'd never thought to ask him what he wanted to do. I just made this kind of, here's what's a good death. And that was my second big learning, that what I think and what we all think is often not what the person you're taking care of really wants. And learning to have them trust you enough to let you know that was the second lesson. He, by the way, was a first person, so he stayed at Pine Street. The nurses took amazing care of him, did the tube feedings 3 times a day, and he actually died at Pine Street about a month after that. It was our first experience of doing real end-of-life care or palliative care at Pine Street. So I started out on that realizing this, these nurses really know what they're talking about, and then I started to realize this is complicated. It's not as easy as the ICU at all. And I started realizing the ICU, I had control over everything. You could have lines, you knew what the blood pressures were, you knew all that stuff. But when you're in the shelter, you don't know anything. And the next thing that happened, and I just would share this because John's here, is that we realized that Pine Street Inn was in the middle at that time, and we can talk openly now, of a terrible outbreak of pulmonary tuberculosis. So there were 60 cases, I think, in all by the time everything was said and done, and John can correct that for me, of a really pernicious type of TB that was resistant to the 2 most common medications we use. So everybody needed, if I remember right, and correct me, John, 4 medications every single day for about 18 months to treat it fully. So we're sitting there realizing here's 60 people in the middle of Pine Street Inn who scatter all over town, who need 4 medicines every day so that they don't, 1, die, and 2, they don't spread this to all over town. And that was the night I realized how useless I was as a doctor, that I could write a prescription or I could talk to John about what to do, but finding out how to get them that medicine, making sure they took it, monitoring all that, took the whole village. And that's what I learned when working with the specialists, working with the city and the state departments of public health, working with the nurses, and then the outreach teams. That was how we had to put together that whole thing. And I don't know if John remembers this, but I wanted to mention it tonight. But one night in 1986, when we're in the middle of doing all that, this student from Harvard came kind of huffing and puffing into Pine Street wanted to learn what we were doing with TB. And this was Paul Farmer when he was a student. And Paul, who many of you know, just died about 3 weeks ago just way tragically in Rwanda. So Paul was really interested in tuberculosis, and he came down, and he was at Harvard Medical School at the time, and he had a couple of concerns. One, he wanted to learn. I don't know if you remember this, John. He wanted to learn everything about how we were doing and how we were making sure people got their medication. And then the other thing he wanted to know was, hey, wait a minute, you were at Harvard Medical School. Did they help you get your job here at Pine Street Inn? And I said yes, but not that much. But he then said, and I'll never forget this, he said, well, I'm going to change all that, just like that. And he did, believe it or not. I mean, he went, as you know, he just did remarkable things all over the world. Whenever I would be in a panel with him after that, he used to make fun of me because we would be talking about stuff, and he would introduce me and say, Jim's been doing this for about 10 years, and I want to make sure you know that he's never gotten more than a mile from medical school. My entire career is in 1 mile of medical school. And so he'd laugh at me for that and describe what he was doing in Peru and Rwanda and, Haiti. But then he would very, very, as he always was, but he'd very brilliantly say, do you know that in the shadows of all of our great institutions in Boston, they're seeing the same really awful health disparities that he would see in Haiti and Rwanda and place. So that's when I remember we used to say international health all the time, and it's changed. It evolved into global health. That he started, you started to say, our job is to take care of people wherever they are in the globe, whether it's in the shadows or way around the world. So Paul became a really wonderful, Paul's genius was that he belonged to the world, but each of us who knew him thought he was a very special friend, and he took great care of us. So just a note of thanks to Paul and a memory of that. But so TB, we were working on this TB problem when all of a sudden the first people homeless people in Boston, this is 1985 now, were diagnosed with AIDS, and pretty soon the AIDS epidemic just raged through. And I kept thinking about people who are homeless, they have no one, nothing, they have no money, no place to be, and now they're devastated by immunocompromise and getting all these opportunistic infections. And basically back then, because we didn't know, I know there were a small group of people that didn't progress, but everybody died. And I remember thinking, this was too overwhelming, that the whole taking care of people who are living in such poverty, under such duress, struggling to survive every day, is an impossible job to do. And when you've got something like, what I remember is one of the worst things you could have was this, if you were homeless, was there was an effect of AIDS where you would have chronic diarrhea, really awful chronic daily diarrhea. And I don't know, someday you should come. We try to do a tour where the public toilets are in Boston. There are none. The only ones that you really can get to are the ones in the hospitals, which incidentally closed down during COVID, and the ones at Dunkin' Donuts, which also closed down during thing, or you have to go to the train stations. That's it. There are no public toilets otherwise. And so it was horrible. And I just remember thinking, how could we as a society like this just allow this to happen right in the midst of all this plenty? Then there were lots of other stories, and I'm going to stop after this, but one was that I was thinking about today that comes up a lot, and we had someone who just died this past Friday, because death, it turns out we've done lots of studies, and people who live on the streets of Boston, or put it this way, homeless people in Boston die at 4 times the rate of someone the same age who's housed in Boston. So there's something about homelessness is either, I don't know if it's causal, but it's certainly associated with high rates of premature mortality. But if you live on the streets of Boston, meaning you don't go into the shelters, your risk of mortality escalates by 3-fold. So those folks are about 12 to 15 times more likely to die than someone the same age. And these are people living like you see them every day, right? I used to think they were hardy survivors. These are the tough folks who survived. But they look that way, but they don't survive. And the leading cause of death for these folks, believe it or not, is not drug overdose like we might think, it's cancer. So cancer is the leading cause of death. And here I am thinking I was going to become an oncologist, and here it was in a world where people were dying of cancer. Second leading cause at that time was AIDS, and now it's heart disease and liver disease. And overdoses now, which we can talk about later, are starting to rise to become the other common thing. So if you're a doctor, this is complicated stuff, and people are dying, and we should be doing much better care. It was a huge indictment of us, is what I realized. But anyway, there was one woman who used to live on, I spend, Pine Street Inn has a van that goes out every night from 9 at night till 5 in the morning. You probably all know about that. It's like, they are my heroes. Talk about saints in the world, but it's run by people, it is a job, and they're mostly people who have experienced homelessness themselves. Many are in recovery, but they're out every night. This is 9 at night till 5 in the morning, and they know everybody outside, and they are remarkable in that they have this one characteristic that they share where they just never judge anything. They've been through it all, so they don't judge. And it's funny to be around people who don't make any judgments ever. It's kind of breathtaking. But I've been able to ride on that van on Mondays and Wednesdays up until COVID recently. It was for years. And that's how I've gotten to know most of the people living on the streets. And that's the patient population that I've gotten really attached to taking care of. But what we do is we bring foods. It's soup, sandwiches, blankets. The homeless people themselves didn't want a doctor. They didn't want a medical van. And as one man said to me one night, he said, "How would you like your doctor showing up in your bedroom at 2 in the morning unannounced," right? And it took that actually captured me, because I don't, nobody wants that. And we're trying to find them. And they say, usually we ask when we want to go to the doctor, why don't you give us a break? And so we bring food and sandwiches and blankets and stuff, and then just happen to say, if you need anything else, we're here to help. And it turns out to be, and this was done by the homeless people themselves and the Pine Street folks, it's brilliant. It's totally brilliant. But there was one lady who called herself a bag lady, lived on a stoop down by South Station, and drank terribly, but was, just distraught by many things. And her way to keep everybody away was she would surround herself with really smelly stuff. Like she'd buy a quart of milk and leave it there for weeks, and then boiled eggs, just leave them in an open thing there. And at first we just said, this lady just lives in squalor. And we started to realize after a while that this was just her protective shield. And we were trying to bring sandwiches and give her a blanket and stuff. And over time, we sort of won her over. We were thrilled when people would accept what we were offering, because it felt we had done the right thing. But she ended up getting hepatitis C from a blood transfusion back in the early 1990s. Never stopped drinking and went on to get real bad liver failure. And the only way she was going to survive was if she could get a liver transplant. And most homeless people don't qualify to be on those lists. But we made a sort of a Faustian pact with the surgeons, and they said if she would stay we have a respite program, if she would stay there for 6 months and we could show that she stayed sober and that she was what they called residentially stable for 6 months, they'd consider putting her on the list. And to make a very long story short, she did this remarkable job of staying through that. And when it was getting near the end of 6 months, she called me in when I was in there on a Sunday morning, and she called me over and she said, "Would you mind taking my picture?" And up until that time, I didn't take pictures because I thought that was kind of voyeuristic and taking advantage of people. I would take picture of clinical things like an arm or a leg or a cut, but never a face or something like that. And so she got all dressed up. This is a woman who called herself a bag lady. She got this linen dress. I don't know where she got it. And put lipstick on, put her hair in a bun, fingernail polish, and nice shoes. And she went out and got some flowers. We had a garden outside our building, and put them in her styrofoam cup and put them on her bedside table, and then stood there and posed for this picture that I took with a kind of awful camera. But I brought it back to her in the afternoon. I put it in a little frame and I gave it to her. And being the oncologist in my mind, I said, "She's afraid of death, and I better have a talk about dying, and is she okay?" Because this was going to be big surgery. So I sat down with her and I said, "You want to talk about this? Because I know this is a big deal." And she looked at me like I was a little crazy, and she said, and put her arm around me and said, "Look, I'm not afraid of dying." She said, "I've been out on the streets for 27 years. He said, "I face death every night." She said, "Many nights I'd actually welcome it. So I'm not afraid of that." And then she said, and this is what I will never forget, she said, "You know what though? I have two daughters. One was 3 years old and the other was 5 years old when I last saw them, which is now 24 years ago." She said, "And I just want to have a picture of me looking relatively okay in case they ever want to go looking for their mother." And I realized it was all about legacy. It was all about taking care of her children that she had been separated from. Now, leave that alone. I was kind of blown away. But the next day that I came in, there were 22 people in our respite thing who asked to have their pictures taken. And now we have, if you come into our respite program, we have portraits of people all around. The exact opposite what I would have thought. People who I thought would be seeking anonymity and not want to be talked about, kind of proud and anxious to have a picture of them when they're doing well and looking okay, to show that they've been here, that they're part of this world. So that acceptance and acknowledgement has become a really big thing. I think I could go on with crazy stories, but I think I'm gonna leave it with one of the things that has been exquisitely discouraging for me, and I would urge, this is what I'd love to talk about sometime, is I think the causes of homelessness we've simplified. And I certainly have simplified. I remember in 2004 or 5, we were able to get access to low threshold housing for the first time for most of the people who've been out there for a long time. And I was ecstatic, because getting people from the streets into housing meant that you at least have a chance now to start putting life together and doing stuff. But what we've learned from that is that that's only the first step, and that people going into housing still need a huge amount of care and effort and support, which we don't often do, because it's hard enough to just get the housing, but then to have another attached support is awkward. So as we've watched as our folks have gotten into housing, we realize it looks good for about a year, but then about 3 years later, there's only about a third of them there, and about 5 years later, almost nobody's still in housing. But we don't look at that, and we don't seem to, watch what's going on. And then the mortality rates when people get into housing actually go up rather than down. So we're now struggling with how to acknowledge or how to recognize that homelessness is not the result of just a lack of housing. It's usually the result of horrible education, awful adverse effects in childhood, the trauma, all the things that you might have been through. We have a quarter of the people living on the streets can't read or write. So that means way back somewhere, they had learning disabilities or intellectual limitations that never got addressed. And those are the things that determine 30 or 40 years later what's going on. So we've had to come to grips with, we're trying to take care of people whose determinants of their ill health happened so far ago we can't really change much. But we gotta start changing it if we're gonna stop the flow of this. So the thing that we're starting to learn now is, really, if I had one thing to do to stop or to end homelessness in the future, I would pay teachers whatever they need to make sure our schools are good and make sure they're not in terrible neighborhoods. I would fix the schools. and you guys know from school here what that means. So anyway, and then we've learned it's complicated. It's all the things, veterans, there's elderly people now, there's young kids, it's homeless families. It's very complicated. So I'd urge you, just when you think about that, to just to remember that. And finally, Barbara McGinnis, I remember I remember when I first started, I would be frustrated because everybody be asking you for money. Can you give me something? What do you do? And I'm sure you run into that all the time. And what's the right thing to do? And I remember asking Barbara McGinnis, and she would say, "Oh, I don't know what to do." And Barbara was always so down to earth. She said, sometimes I just decide on Tuesdays I'll give everybody money, or no, I'll pick one person. But she then in seriousness, what she urged us to do was to not worry about the money, but never always look somebody in the eye and say, "Sorry, not today," but "Hello, how you doing?" but not today. So her approach was, it's not the money, it's the acknowledgement. And I've been stunned over time to realize that's, as we've gotten to know people better, that's all they're really looking for, is don't look past me, okay? Just acknowledge that I'm here. And if there's anything I guess I've learned from the nurses and then from the homeless folks themselves, that's really what it's all about. It's just trying to make them part of our community. And we can't fix everything, but we can sure help ease some of their suffering and take care of them. And I think I'm going to stop there because I have no idea what the time is, but I would love to ask, there's a million other topics and ways to go, but I'd love to, Kevin, is that how, is it okay to just go like this? Yep. Oh, there's a live stream, okay. Okay, sure. Kevin.
I'm not your agent, but I would say anything in this room, you've only seen the surface of what your book is. Please, please read Jim's book. It is so deep and so thoughtful. But my question is, when you spoke to our group sometime in the past, you talked about we're all the beneficiaries of privilege and medical records. And you talked about, that the homeless, one day they're in the General, one day they're in the Brigham, one day they're at BI. You really control the best medical records of a lot of these people. And how do you help them with medical records, Jim?
It's an astute question that Kevin is asking, because one of the challenges we've always had is because people are wandering around, they end up in different institutions. And I realize now, had I been God, I would have allowed only one electronic medical record for everybody in the country. Instead, we have this competition with 15,000 different medical records, and if you're in one hospital, it's a system you can't see from another. But we were lucky back in the early 1990s, and my hat is off again to Mass General on this one. Octo Barnett, who was the head of the Laboratory of Computer Sciences, we told him this was our problem, people going all over the place. This is back when everything was a paper record, and we don't know if some doctor saw them at Pine Street 2 nights ago and they're showing up now in the emergency room. What happened? We couldn't do that. And he helped us put together an electronic medical record. This is back in 1993 and 94. And I realized, I think this is the point, sometimes when you take care of these very vulnerable and fragile populations, they teach you really early where the weaknesses are in our own system. And that weakness of lack of coordination, created tons of duplication in the system. So we can now say, because in our record will be wherever they've seen, we have 37 different clinics around town, and a clinic at Boston Medical Center and at Mass General, and a respite program, and anything that's happened at any of those sites is all in one record, so you can see it, which has been magic for us, because you can tell the emergency room, no, they've had their MRI at Tufts 2 days ago, you don't have to do another one, stuff like that. So it has been really phenomenal, but we would never have done that except we're trying to chase after something we didn't write. But thank you for that question, Kevin. That's great. Yes?
You do, sorry, Fred. Sorry.
Join the ranks. It's really terrible,
As you went over the different, I'm sure just the surface of some of the reasons for homelessness, you didn't mention at all mental illness. And I was under the impression from things I had read before that was a big part of the homeless population. Is that something that is there, or is that, just misinformed on my part?
Oh, no. It's a huge part of the population and a part of the problem. I think what has happened, though, we've realized that you can give the percentages. The problem is we never know what the denominator is. But in our experience, if you go to the streets and see who's on the streets, about a half to 3/4 of the people really suffer from a significant mental illness. But if you also, the other problem is about 90% of them also have either a substance use problem and or a medical problem. So it's this collision of mental illness with a substance use issue that becomes really difficult in the population, especially on the street. And to some degree, those who live chronically in the shelters, it's the same way. And I could go on and on about that, but it is one of the big, we do not have a robust mental health system to take care of people, as you all know. And I think, in our hospital now, you can go down there and there's probably 20 to 40 people with an acute mental illness sitting in gurneys waiting for some place to go to be cared for. It's horrible. So I think one of the big struggles that we have to cope with as a system is how to coordinate care, the behavioral health care with the medical care and the oral health care. But it's a great question.
Jim, I guess it's loud here.
How did you do that?
Obviously
I
have
couldn't
this
do that.
homeless problem in every major city in the country. How are they dealing with it? Are there organizations comparable to yours which have arisen in various cities, or in general, how is it addressed?
No, another wonderful question. So something I've had to learn is that homelessness can be different depending on which city you're in. And sort of just like healthcare systems are different depending where you are. But I'll give you an example so growing up in the homeless community in Boston here in my professional life, about 90% of all people who are homeless in Boston are in shelters each night. Okay, so there's a really fabulous shelter system that has evolved. Most of them have started with religious communities, evolved into becoming more, funded by the state and secular, like Pine Street, which used to be the urban priests running it. And they do a phenomenal job. And especially on cold nights, that people are in. So on the streets of Boston, which is the population I'm fascinated by, that's probably only about 5 or less % of the total population. I've spent a lot of time working in Skid Row in LA, and there it's the other way around. There's almost no shelter beds, and 90% of everybody lives outside on the streets. It's much better weather, but it's a different problem in a different scenario. And then the same for many West Coast cities like San Francisco, not many shelters, lots of people on the street. Portland, Seattle, same system. But in New York, for example, it looks more like Boston, a robust shelter system, not that many people on the street, but the problem is still there. It's just a different setting. But it poses interesting, so for us, having clinics means that we can do having shelters means we can do clinics in those shelters and catch people when they come in at night, have their meal, we can then see them. If they live on the street, you've got to go figure out how to see them in a place that can do it. And we're learning, this is part of the advocacy issues, that I think people thought, certainly around here, that shelters are not the way to go. Shelters, we've had them forever. It's a failed social policy. We need to get people housed. And so the shelter beds have been going down. More and more people have been living on the streets. And we haven't been able to have enough housing done to make up the difference. So we get caught in that. And that's what's happened in many cities. By the way, I would also point out, I think, Pat, you might be getting to this. It is also an urban homelessness problem and a rural homelessness problem. But when they do the counts of homelessness around the country, and roughly there's 600,000 people homeless in America on any given night, most of them, 80%, are in a major urban area, meaning LA, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, and on. And very few, relatively speaking, are scattered in the smaller cities and rural areas. So the solutions to the problems are different depending on where your geography is. Does that make sense? I might have left stuff out, but that's kind of it. Yes, sorry.
Dr. O'Connor, what a wonderful presentation tonight, but I'm actually curious about the finance of healthcare for the homeless. Not your organization, but it seems to me that it's changed since you began in 1985, but it doesn't seem to be moving, that there's a well stream of steady money that's going in to improve some of the, I'm following the Mass and Cass situation and what they're trying to do in the city of Boston. And are these health services paid for by Medicaid or Medicare? What's happening financially for you and for the whole care of homeless?
That's a question I usually try to dodge, so I wish you hadn't done that, okay? But, if ever, I count our blessings, living in Massachusetts has been a huge blessing, especially when I compare notes with my friends working around the country. So Massachusetts has had a really wonderful Medicaid program, which of course under Romney expanded to include almost every homeless person. So all of the folks we take care of have Medicaid, essentially. There's a few exceptions. And that means if we take care of them, if you're a doctor or nurse practitioner of PA, which is the core of you can get Medicaid payment for that service. And so we can sustain ourselves through Medicaid. Now, you also need a lot of other money to make sure you can take an hour with somebody rather than 10 minutes. But Medicaid provides that basic funding for us to keep us going. It wasn't always like that, and I think that's where I'm seeing other states where they haven't expanded Medicaid, it's much more difficult. Because, for example, when we first started, only about maybe 10% of homeless people had Medicaid in Massachusetts, and the rest were under the free care pool and all these other things. But we couldn't get reimbursed, so you had to get grant money to get your doctors and nurses to go out and see people. And the first 4 years we operated, we had a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation grant. So we didn't have a finance department, we never sent a bill, we just went out and did our work. And in many ways, I missed that time. But then when that grant ended, we became part of the federal system where we are, what's called a federally qualified health center, and we have to bill Medicaid. But it is a way to sustain yourselves. And there are about 350 programs around the country that are like ours, funded by that Medicaid stream. We all look very different because we're the only one that really stays part of a hospital and part of the community and has a respite program. So we're lucky. That's because we have wonderful hospitals, wonderful medical schools and nursing schools who embrace this as part of what they should be doing. That's not like that necessarily around the country. So we're really blessed in that sense, but thank you for that question.
Thanks, Kelly. I'm interested in the concept of community among the homeless, and the comment you made about the gentleman who missed that in the nursing home and wanted to go back to be among his friends. And someone mentioned Melanie Cass today, and I read in the paper that some of the people that were living there have tried to go back again to that same place because their housing was not really what they liked. And I just wonder, what is it about the homeless community? What do they find on the street that maybe we could learn to supply as we look to find them a safe shelter?
Wait, it's profound, but that's been the question of the last few years. And I can sort of answer that a little bit obliquely. There is, and we've learned this as people go into housing, realizing what they miss when they go into housing. And it turns out there is a community on the streets. Their friends are there, they can go outside and they can be talking to people and be surrounded by some sort of community. When they come into the example we all know who work in the hospital, if you take a homeless person from the streets of the shelters and put him in a hospital bed and say you got to stay here while you're sick, you can't go outside, you can't go smoke, you can't do anything, they can't handle it. And so they leave against medical advice all the time because there's too many there's too many restrictions put on you. And we do everything we can to try to get them to stay till they finish the treatment that we need them to do. So we're learning, like, our respite program, which is not ideal. We have to let people wander around. We have to give them lots of space, and they'll stay in that setting. But even there, they're a little bit too cooped up. And we've learned most profoundly when people that have been downtown, for example, and you say, why are you staying outside on these cold nights? And you can get them into housing. And we have several homeless people on our board of directors. And just to let you know, so our program is now like a $60 million a year program. We have 40 doctors and more than that, nurse practitioners and PAs. But we have several homeless people on our board of directors who basically are our bosses. I say that with some pride, actually. That was their call and they've done it. But the vice chair of our board, who died about 6 months ago, when he first got placed in housing after 30 years on the streets, was placed in a really nice place in Hyde Park, right? And he got in this apartment and he tried to go to sleep and he couldn't because it was too quiet and there was no one around. And so what he did was, in his creativity, he went back down to Boston City Hospital, Boston Medical Center, and he sat outside with a little tape recorder and recorded the ambulances coming and the police going. And that's what he played every night to go to sleep. And it gave a little insight into that. One of the things we have to learn about housing is it's housing, but you need to have a community. You have to have some hope. You have something around. And that's what we haven't done very well. But the streets do that in this upside down way. It's a place where they belong. You know, their friends are not going to disparage them the way they might get disparaged when they go into a store. So, you know, we've sort of in an interesting way driven them into that community because we've disenfranchised them or we stigmatized them so much. So trying to work through that, I think, that's only one little part of the inside. It's obviously much more complicated, but I would say that.
Hi, everyone. I'm Beth. I am a peer counselor, actually, and I worked at Boston Medical Center for 10 years. I also worked at Shattuck, Mass General, did a lot of outreach, and learned a great deal with the homeless. I'm wondering how you can bring the church into their lives and more community. Actually, at the Shattuck, many of them lived there for 15 years, and it was just extremely sad because they had criminal backgrounds as well as addiction, as well as mental health conditions. And I really wish, how we can serve them better within the church.
I appreciate that comment because that is exactly, finding hope and finding community is the secret, and finding a reason. It's part of it. By the way, I feel like you followed me around because I love the Shattuck. That was where our first respite was, and I've been at all those other places. And thank you for what you did, because we have on our teams now, we have recovery coaches who are peer counselors, and they are like magic for us because they are the people that break the ice and help us understand what's going on. So thanks for doing that.
Jim, we all know this is a societal kind of problem, and my expectation is that, we depend tremendously on the government to help with society and also church-affiliated things. What kind of assistance do you get from big business?
The last part, what do we get from big business, did you say? Oh, right. It's funny, to answer that, I want to say, oh God, not enough. But the truth is, I've been impressed by the community around here. So I think doing our work, initially it was kind of hard, but once we got to know people, so the hospitals and the medical schools have been incredibly supportive, if not with money, with staffing. But then the health plans have been really helpful. And then the business community has been incredibly generous. Where it became most evident to me, just to share with you, we had a terrible problem with COVID. So if you think Pine Street Inn, 500 people, the virus gets in there, virtually half of the people got COVID. It was actually, to be honest, it was about 38% of everybody got COVID, and the staff was converting because you're all in a little room. And then the community got really together to find alternate places for people to go. We ended up with a lot of help from the governor and the mayor and Mass General and Boston Medical Center. We ran 500 beds in the Boston convention center where homeless people and people marginally housed could go and recover, be isolated and recover from COVID. And that kind of stuff all came from a community outpouring, which was quite striking to me. The other thing that we get great support from that doesn't get heralded very much is the police and first responders. Boston, and I assume it's the same when I say Boston, our program's only in Boston, I'm sure it extends to the others, but the police are incredibly kind. And they have worked together with us. We have a meeting once every week with the police, the MBTA police, the state police, there's the park rangers and the Boston police with all the outreach workers. And the goal of that is to change the issue from being a police issue into being something that the outreach workers and our health can convert it into a public health issue. And so they'll say, we're getting tons of complaints for 3 people in an alleyway on Beacon Hill. Can you guys go and try to talk them into not doing that? And we can do that usually a whole lot easier and better than a policeman with a thing. So that has been, and I should argue, it's funny, I did this job for the longest time. So I was under Mayor Flynn, Mayor Menino, and then Mayor Walsh. So I remember the first 30 years of doing this job, we had 3 mayors. And all of those mayors, now we've had a series since then, or 2 more since then, but they've been incredibly supportive, unlike many mayors I've seen around the country. So I wish I could complain more, but I think we've been great. I think from a societal point of view, like how we're going to scale up funding for housing, scale up funding for the supports that people are going to need, I think that's a societal issue that we'll still have to face, because that's nowhere near addressed. But it's been just a pleasure being in Boston, where people at least be kind and try to solve a problem as opposed to get angry with it. Mass and Cast, which I did not talk about, became a real crucible for all of us, and we could talk about that in another time, but it's getting better, but there are people that are going to go back there for exactly the reason. That's where their community is.
Well, please join me in thanking Dr. O'Connell for this evening.
Thank
you so much.
And so I can't listen. Thank you all for being here. Are you kidding me? I also don't know. I've been looking around, but Sarah Pacelli, who is the person that takes care of me during all these things, is right here. So Sarah and Mimi, I know, are here. So I wanted to also say thank you to our staff for being here and helping out tonight. Thank you very much. Okay.
For those of you who are not familiar with the St. John St. Paul Collaborative Lenten Gift, our 2 parishes annually discern a major focus for our Lenten prayers and financial contributions. Our past Lenten gifts have included Nuestros Pequeños Hermanos, our Catholic Charities Partnership in the Power parishes organized to welcome immigrants and refugees, the Bakita House, and our local St. Vincent de Paul. This, just to name a few. This year, our Lenten gift will be to benefit Boston Healthcare for the Homeless. We are working with our team to identify the best area where our gift can make the best impact for those experiencing homelessness in our community. Our official collection for all of the masses will be on the weekend of April 6th and 7th. However, you are able to make a Lenten gift donation this evening anytime if you'd like to visit our website by scanning the QR codes that are in the lobby of St. John's this evening. Let the staff know, and they can walk you through it by just opening your phone to your camera app, and we can walk you through the steps if that's new to you. It's new to most of us. Dr. O'Connell has also graciously agreed to sign books for us this evening, so be sure to grab a copy of his book for $20 in the lobby, and you can get his signature. On Wednesday, March 30th, Sue Brady Hartigan, who is a volunteer with Pine Street Inn, and Deirdre Heilbrunn, who is a nurse with Barbara McGinnis House, right? It's the Barbara McGinnis House. We'll be hosting an evening of conversation about the book and get a clear view of the mission and have just a great conversation about the mission. So please, you won't want to miss that. And finally, another huge thank you to Dr. O'Connell. Thank you so much.